So on behalf of the New Jersey Society of Optometric Physicians, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. This afternoon's webinar entitled COVID-19 and Your Lease Options is presented by Mr. Charles Feitel and Mr. Tom Linehan and is sponsored by Health Pro Realty Group. My name is Dr. George Fulicki, Chair of the NJSOP Continuing Education Committee, and I would like to pass along some relevant information before the start of the program. Please use the Q&A function located at the bottom of the Zoom page to submit questions at any time during the webinar. Questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. For reference, note that this webinar is being recorded so that we can make this information accessible following the conclusion of our program. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. Chuck Feitel graduated from the University of Michigan in 1982 and the University of Toledo College of Law in 1985. Although a lawyer by education, he has been in the commercial real estate business since the mid-'80s. Having worked with Trammell Crow and WRIT, Mr. Feitel was responsible for the management and leasing of significant portfolios of office and retail properties. Since 1996, his firm has specialized in the representation of medical, dental, optometric, and other healthcare professionals within their commercial real estate needs. In addition, he has professionally represented several different healthcare institutions. Moreover, his firm has leased millions of square feet of medical office space for a who's who list of medical office building owners. Mr. Feitel is recognized as an industry leader in healthcare real estate and has been a featured speaker at many national healthcare summits. Having worked with hundreds of healthcare providers over the years, Mr. Feitel has learned the ins and outs of medical real estate. Since 1996, he has represented medical real estate transactions in excess of $1 billion. Billion with a B. Tom Linehan joined Health Pro Realty Group after his experience as an investment sales agent with Marcus and Millichap in northern New Jersey. He also has had extensive experience working with private real estate investors in the Northeast region for the past 7 years. His focus is working on both tenant representation and landlord assignments in all healthcare disciplines, including medical, dental, and optometric. He graduated with a risk management degree with a focus in real estate from Penn State University and is leading the charge in the company's growth into New Jersey and New York. Finally, we'd like to thank Health Pro Realty Group for their sponsorship and for making today's webinar possible. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Charles Feitel and Tom Linehan.
Doctor, thank you very much for the introduction. We're going to go through a PowerPoint, and you all have an ability to chat, so please feel free to ask questions. We'll try to address those at the end. I appreciate the intro. We have a familiarity with your organization. We actually, about 1.5 years ago, did a live presentation in Hamilton. We were slated to do another one last, I think it was March 15th. So we know that didn't happen. We are going to actually do a sequel to this presentation in a couple or 3 weeks, which we will notify and market you of. We help healthcare professionals with their commercial real estate needs, and we can help whether it be a new lease, a new purchase, leasing a space, subletting a space. But right now in this pandemic situation, what we're doing probably more than any of is lease renewals. And depending on where you are within your lease cycle, it could be an ideal time to renegotiate your lease. The savings could be significant. I'm going to go specifically. Let me clarify. The healthcare business is not really in a recession. My clients tell me that 95% of doctors, dentists, and optometrists are paying their rent timely. I know some of you probably were able to negotiate some reductions or deferments at the height of the pandemic, but knock on wood, you know, your profession and my profession, because you're who I work with, you all seem to be surviving this nightmare. But what has happened is and I'm sure you follow this, office tenants have shut their doors. Office tenants are rethinking whether they're going to come back into the marketplace. Retail businesses are effectively done with a few exceptions. So the only businesses really thriving right now are medical, healthcare, and industrial. So what's happened is a recession has been created in the commercial real estate business. So if you are an optometrist and you are in, let's say, an 80,000 square foot neighborhood shopping center in central Jersey, You most likely have more vacancy now than you did pre-pandemic because a couple of restaurants and gyms and or movie theaters and bowling alleys are not in business. And so the overall malaise of the retail market has caused a recession / depression in all of commercial real estate. And what you can do for that landlord is maintain a business when everyone else is concerned if they're even going to be able to stay afloat. So let me get this started here if I can and get to my first slide. Okay. Let me see. Okay. So basically what we do, we negotiate the basic what we call deal / business terms of a real estate transaction. Those being defined as the rent that you pay, the free rent that you may receive as part of the negotiation, improvements, which is tenant improvements, which is money that is received by the landlord, as well as escalations, which is the annual increase that you'll have in your lease, when it will start, how much, and then other basic terms such as, do you have a right to get out of the lease? Do you have an option to renew? Can you assign the lease? How the lease is guaranteed? And these are all the things that we negotiate for you by having a knowledge of what's going on in your current market. Now, unlike some other real estate companies that do what we do, we only do healthcare and we're boots on the ground. Tom is in New Jersey. So Tom knows the real estate market in New Jersey, knows the landlords, knows the pulse of the market. And that's how we're able to negotiate these effective deal terms for you. So it's not just negotiating better or cheaper in rent or more free rent or more tenant improvement dollars, but knowing what landlords are doing and giving in the current climate in order to effectuate the best deal for you. Now, depending on your lease term, there could be an opportunity to negotiate a lease that's already in effect. It really all comes down to the amount of time that's left on your lease. So for example, you've signed a contract. Unfortunately, if you signed a contract 2 years ago and you have 8 years left on your lease, even though we're in the middle of the pandemic, we're willing to reach out and give it a shot, but chances are the landlord doesn't want to talk to us because he or she doesn't have to. Unfortunately, you signed an agreement, you're obligated. It's all timing, and what it is what it is. And it's going to be very difficult to get that landlord to renegotiate the better terms for you because it's all about, if you will, quid pro quo. And you can't really give the landlord anything if he or she were to reduce your rent. It's all about what they in turn can give back to you. And if there's a lot of term left on their lease, there really isn't anything that can be done. So these guys are really good at what they do, and they will typically wait until there's not a whole lot of time left on your lease to start talking about the renewal process. And they do that for a couple of reasons. First reason they do that for is your lease somewhere hidden in the 30 or 45th page has a holdover clause, which says that if you stay in the space month to month and do not renew your lease, your rent doubles or sometimes triples. So that hammer by this professional bully is what forces you to effectively sign whatever they put in front of you. So time is everything. And normally we say that 15 to 18 months before your lease expires is the ideal situation to reach out to the landlord to posture and create this leverage situation. But Tom, tell them about a recent scenario you had with a doctor in suburban Maryland where this actually, it's even better now. And I'm convinced we're going to see more of this, but tell them what happened with our doctor in Maryland.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. So, as he had mentioned, it's kind of that, 12 to 15 month period, where we kind of, begin to have that conversation to allow enough time. But, part of why it was so important on why we wanted to have this webinar and get some of this information out to you is because, with everything going on in the market right now, there's actually some great opportunities that you could take advantage of. And as Chuck had mentioned, an example of something that we were working on was, It was a dermatologist that we were speaking with, and they had about 3 years, maybe a little longer left on their lease. And, normally we'll wait till around, that 12, 15-month period. But we had basically had the conversation with him that, he was paying, well over $40 a foot, which was, above the market, which kind of alludes to the escalations that were part of the lease. But he was paying significantly higher than the market. And we had the conversation with him and said, basically, I know there's 3 years left on the lease, but what we could do considering, what's going on in the market, a lot of these landlords are actually entertaining the conversation of doing an earlier renewal. Obviously, they may have some tenants that aren't paying or other tenants that are going out of business. And obviously someone like this is a good asset to have as a tenant. So we actually were able to get the landlord to agree to renew the lease 3 years early, and extend him for about a 10-year period, in which we were able to bring down his rental rate to about $32.50 a foot, and restart the base year basically, which right off the bat, on those initial or the remaining 3 years on his lease, was an instant savings of about $60,000. And that's not even taking into account, the remainder of the years that would be on that deal, still keeping him well under what he was currently paying. And pretty much at the end of that renewal, he wasn't even going to be paying as much as he was now. So that's just an example of, exactly why it's so important to try to have this conversation right now, because stuff that normally wouldn't fly, everything is kind of on the table now, because it's such a unique market, and everything going on, really allows us to help you obviously get as much savings as possible, and something that we normally wouldn't be able to do without this market.
And the reason for the 15 to 18 months typically is that that's effectively the strike time to cut another deal at a competing property. The landlord knows that, and that's when you can garner their attention. So in a typical market 3 years before, they don't want to talk to you because you're typically going to be paying over the market. They know they have you under contract, and they're not going to want to talk to you. But their landlords are running scared because of the current market and the current future of the market. So even if you have a couple, 3 years left on your lease, if you're willing to talk about giving them significant term on an early renewal, they're willing to really wheel and deal. So there's really no reason not to talk to them and ask them what kind of opportunities they are. Now, we're able to do this effectively with market knowledge. This is everything. So in Tom's scenario he gave you, the doctor was paying about $42. It was a $32 market, which is why we were able to get this immediate $10 per square foot savings, which for this gentleman was $25,000 a year. So it was an instant $25,000 annual savings, not to speak of what it is going forward. But again, and I said this earlier when I started, the market knowledge is everything, because anyone could come in and potentially just say to the landlord, drop the rate $1 or $2, throw you a couple bucks to get new paint, new carpeting, maybe throw in a month of free rent. But we don't negotiate in a vacuum. We know what's going on in the marketplace. And then in light of the current recession that we're in, we ask for even a better deal, because we find that if you never know until you ask. Tom, tell them about the deal we did with an optometrist in suburban Northern Virginia. I want to say it was this summer, if I'm not mistaken. So tell them kind of what the rate was pre-COVID, and then what deal we were able to get in the middle of COVID, and kind of how it happened, because it's kind of interesting and indicative of the times we're in.
Yeah. So yeah, basically, this deal that we were working on was an optometrist that, was looking for a retail space. And we were working with a shopping center, very busy shopping center. There was a Harris Teeter in the parking lot there as well. So there was a ton of action. And normally, the spaces there were going in, probably we're leasing for like the mid 40s, maybe 45 a foot, kind of that standard, expensive retail space. And, we were looking with our client, and basically we were talking with the agent there as we were looking through the space. And we had pretty much said, so what are you guys, looking and quoting on a space like this? And, to our surprise, she had pretty much said, tell us what you want, make an offer, and we'll kind of see what we could do. And, we kind of looked at each other and we had talked to our client and we had just said, yeah, we want to pay, $32 a foot, or it was maybe 32 or 33 a foot in a market that was normally 45. Kind of just hoping that, with that number, maybe they'll meet us in the middle there or something that would still be, a great rate. And, right as we said it, she had agreed to that rate, and it was, basically $10 cheaper than it normally was. And again, that kind of attests to the point on what Chuck had said, is basically, the market right now is in such a unique position where, things such as that, where, if you were to walk in there on any normal day and say, no, we want to pay $33 a foot in a market that's normally 45, I mean, they're going to, tell you to walk out the door. But now, especially with everything going on, that's why it's so important that, we get in touch and kind of figure out exactly what your situation is. Because like we had previously mentioned, that amount of years that we normally look at and try to have the conversation, that's just been extended. And basically, all of the past kind of, basically everything that was normal is different now. And it's really, puts the ball in your court as to get a great deal. Take advantage of the market now while it's still low, as and what we're hoping that things will get better and start to get brighter. And being able to lock yourself into something now, such as that, with, locking that in for the next, say 10 years, it's really going to put you ahead of the game in terms of what you're paying on your rent, the money that we can get for the office and everything. So, having that conversation now is extremely important. So,
As George mentioned in his intro, I'm 30 plus years in this, and the closest thing I've seen to this was the recession of '08 and '09, when the economy wasn't good. A lot of government contractors vacated space, retail businesses were slow, inflation was high. Landlords were a little bit nervous, but the difference here is that then landlords had done it before, they had survived it, they knew it was kind of a cycle, and they were willing to sort of gamble that they would stand firm and things would get better, and they didn't have to do this. Well, here we are, a year post-pandemic. The real estate market, if anything, is worse than when it started from a landlord perspective. And, they really, no one knows. The $64,000 question is, when do things get back to normal, and what is the new normal? So in the meantime, there's a strike time, if you will, to really, we think, seize the opportunities. And I'll talk about how we get compensated and everything, which you're going to like, but there's really kind of nothing to lose to take a look at what your options are. I want to discuss briefly roles of lawyers and brokers. It's a big deal. So we work closely with lawyers. We actually really like Jim Schrager, who I think you guys know. I think he still represents the association. He's a lawyer who gets it. So he covers the legalese in a transaction. So we think the best way to do this, you could have your lawyer reach out on your behalf and say, hey, we're in a pandemic. Can I get a better deal? And can we renegotiate my lease? The problem with that is twofold. One, you got to pay the lawyer $300, $400, $500 an hour to have that conversation. But the bigger problem is, honestly, and Jim would tell you this, the lawyer doesn't know what the best deal is that you can get. We're the only ones that know the best deal that you can get. So we actually, if we can effectuate something for you, we get paid a commission. That's our compensation from the landlord. So you don't pay for our service, and we save you tens and thousands of dollars, and we'll get you as close to that floor of the deal as you can possibly get. So that sounds like the trifecta to me. So we're not bashing lawyers. As Jim mentioned, I am a lawyer, and the lawyers do play a role. I think we want them to review the legalese to cover important things like, can you assign your lease? What happens in the event of a default? What happens, God forbid, in the event of a bankruptcy? There are legal terms in a document, but it doesn't make sense to have them, they're specialists. You all are specialists in eye care. They're specialists in legalese, not in basic deal terms. So I have the slide, contact the landlord 15 to 18 months before expiration. Again, that's the norm. We're not in the norm. I would say, Tom, what do you think? 3.5 years? I think even with 3.5 years, we can talk to a landlord at this point.
Yeah, I would say probably, that around that 3.5 year mark. I mean, even if it's 4 years or so, I mean, having the conversation, and even if it's, even if you're at that 4 year period and say we did try and see if we could renew and we couldn't, the good thing is that basically even at that 4-year mark, we could basically kind of assess your situation, see where you currently are in terms of your rate and how that looks in the market. And even if we aren't able to at the moment to kind of take advantage of the market and say get you renewed early, or if you're even looking to move somewhere else, the good part about it is though is we can kind of create a game plan, figure out exactly what you're looking to do, even start to just take a look to see what's out there. But and Chuck had alluded to it previously, is that you know, you can never have the conversation too early, but you can have the conversation too late. Because as he said, in that lease, there is something that is, you know, called the holdover clause, or it could be labeled something else. But it's something that's kind of frightening, because if say, you know, you kind of let the time go by, you say, I'll handle it, and you just don't end up, you know, renewing the lease or deciding to go elsewhere, you then are in that holdover period, which then you're then obligated to be paying the landlord anywhere from 1.5 to 3 times what you're currently paying in rent. And you know, that's a situation that obviously everybody wants to avoid. So it could really only help. And like Chuck said, you know, it's kind of a win-win to have that conversation. So you know, that's obviously what we would advise.
This slide may be the most significant. Create leverage, making the landlord think you may relocate. So we're the only ones who can do this. The lawyer cannot do this. When the lawyer calls your landlord and says, my client wants to renew the lease, there's no threat, excuse me one second, there's no threat that you're going to, in fact, not renew your lease. If you call wanting to renew your lease, they know you want to renew your lease. If your accountant calls, your brother-in-law calls, anybody else, the landlord is kind of licking his or her chops thinking that you're going to stay. With us, it's the exact opposite. We don't say, give us a good deal or we're leaving, okay? It's implied by what we do and who we are. The landlords know that we're bringing tenants to their spaces, so they know how the game works. And this is how the leverage is created. Now, we've done these presentations for many, many years, and doctors, dentists, optometrists will say to me, well, the landlord's my friend. I give them a 20% discount on eyeglasses, or I see them in church or synagogue, and you know, I don't want to alienate them. This is all business. There's no alienation here, okay? We're not saying to the landlord, give it to you for free. We're not saying to the landlord, drop your rent to $4,000 in a $7,000 a month market. We're simply trying to take advantage of a situation that unfortunately has happened. And if you fall into that window where we can do something, there's absolutely no reason not to investigate if we can create some value for you. The other thing, which is interesting when we do this, is we will look at the market to see if there are other options. Maybe you've decided you want to add a lane. Maybe you want to cut down a lane. Maybe you're tired of paying rent, and maybe now's the time you want to look and see if there's a building that you can purchase. All of these things factor into the plan that we create. So even though we're approaching the landlord on the premise of a renewal, it makes sense now to look, okay, what do I need the next 10 years? Because you don't want to renew your lease with a landlord when if with 2 lanes, if you want 3, or 3 if you want 4, or God forbid the other way, maybe now's the time to downsize. But you don't want to commit for long term with the wrong plan. Or maybe when you pick the space you're in, you did it, but in hindsight, the development has changed in your submarket, and now there's a better center. Or maybe the highway authority has come in, and it's so hard to make a left turn into your shopping center that there's better locations. So it's a plan that we create to make sure that, in fact, while we're doing this on the premise of a renewal, we're looking and seeing if there's other options. Again, we get a commission. So you're talking to Tom, and you're in Princeton, and you're saying, you know, I'm in 2,500 feet, but with the potential growth, maybe I want 3,000, 3,500 feet, and I want to add a lane, and maybe I want to be over here a mile away where the development has changed. Well, we'll go explore what's out there, because you might as well look. I mean, you're not going to know until you look, and you can't judge by seeing leasing signs in front of the property, because they don't tell you the amount of square footage that's available. Also, we know businesses that are going out of business. So unfortunately, a lot of restaurants are going dark. So there may be a restaurant in a pad site, which is that's a technical term, but that's Like if you look at like where the Shoney's are, for example, they're real close to the road as opposed to tucked back in the shopping center. So typically those are not available, but in this market, maybe they are. So maybe there's a Shoney's or a Wendy's or a sub shop that's got that ideal pad site that now is going to become available, and in the pandemic you're going to be able to get for a competitive price. So the idea is you want to look at all the options and see all the possibilities that could potentially be out there. So again, I mentioned again the difference with us and the attorneys. We know what the market rent is. We know the improvements, the money that the landlord should be giving you. We know based on a 3, 5, 7, 10-year lease what that's going to look like. We know what their free rent's going to look like. What's the parking situation in the center? What kind of signage can you get? Do you get sign above your space? Do you get a pylon sign on the street? These are all things that we know about. But again, it's a market that I would say, well, we're asking for everything because we're not hearing no as much as we used to, because you guys are bringing a viable business to the table. And landlords are looking at all these other businesses like what's their future. And at least to date, you know that you all have a viable business.
Mhm. Yeah, and to that point, Chuck, kind of some firsthand experience that I've been seeing as well is that actually, another optometrist client that we're working with about 2-3 weeks ago, we were putting together a schedule as to different locations that they wanted to tour because they're opening up their practice, and we called probably about 6 or 7 agents for potential spaces, and every single agent that I had spoke with and I had said my client is an optometrist, they're looking to open up their own space, and at some point during the conversation with every single one of those agents, they had said that's the ideal tenant that we're looking for. This is what we're asking for, but the landlord does like that use, so they're willing to get aggressive in terms of the terms and everything like that. So I mean, and Chuck had kind of touched to that point where compared to some of these mom and pop restaurants or dry cleaners that are unfortunately having a hard time battling through the pandemic, it's kind of the opposite with our clients and you guys basically, where it's a valuable tenant that's coming into the center, brings in a lot of people, and like you said, I mean that stuff's not going to go anywhere. So again, it's just another kind of chip that's in your favor right now.
Tom and I have a client who's in a high-end area of Arlington, Virginia. He's got a high-end dental office, and he was interested in a space around right when the pandemic started, I think. And we reached out to the landlord, and they said they didn't want to lease to a dentist. They were waiting for a white tablecloth restaurant. So we reached back out to the landlord a few weeks ago and said, "How's that going for you?" And you can imagine. So it's just landlords have ideas, models, what they want to accomplish, but it's really time to think out of the box, even though typically an optometrist is not. In our business, size is a big deal. So if you're in a 50,000 foot shopping center, obviously a 50,000 foot tenant may have more leverage than a 2,000 foot optometrist. But what you're bringing to the table is a viable business that is proven it is pandemic proof. And that's a big deal for these guys. The other thing we look at, which we see a lot of people miss, and I've had horror stories on this. If you look on the third bullet point, is a lease assignable when I sell the business? So a lease is not automatically assignable. We've been involved in transactions where people want to sell their business. They don't have a right to assign the lease. I just did one recently. The landlord knew that the doctor was selling the business for $1 million. And they said, okay, well, for $150,000, I'll give you the right to assign your lease so you can sell your business. And they had to do it because they wouldn't have been able to sell the business without it. So this is the kind of thing that we will focus on, but of course, make sure the lawyer gets in the document. But this is, and I hate to use the words deal breaker, but clearly it's a deal breaker. I mean, you're not going to build your business and then not be able to sell your business because you can't assign your lease. So it's just one of the things that we look at that you might have missed when you did your original lease. It just depends. That's another thing. This is kind of a do-over. So when you did your original lease 5 years ago, or maybe you renewed, whatever, you might have missed a few things. So one of the other services we offer as part of our compensation, which to you is nothing, is we're going to look and make sure that all these basic elements are in your lease now. Typically, if you do renew, the landlord will send what's called a lease amendment, which is a couple, 3 pages, which basically says that the current lease is the driver, with the exception of the new rent and or tenant improvement free rent terms we negotiate. It's also an opportunity to add things that maybe were missed at the original negotiation. So something as critical as a lease assignment is something that we would make sure gets into that new document. And basically, this is what the end result's going to be, we hope, by saving it. And we have saved people. The number is multi-millions over 30 years of doing this, but we do save on an average a couple $100,000 for people when we do this. And again, as I mentioned earlier, looking at succession plan, size of the office, length of the lease. A lot of times I'll have an older doctor wanting to sell who says, I want to do a 1-year extension. I want to do a 2-year extension. Well, you don't, because the buyer of your business needs a lease, and they need a lease, A, to be successful, and B, because the bank won't finance the purchase of your practice unless they have a minimal 5-year lease term. So I understand at the end of your career, it's a little nerve-wracking to be on the hook because you might want to retire. But if you're thinking of selling your business, you clearly want to have term. And then what we do a lot of times with doctors at that stage of their career, we negotiate a competitive long-term lease, but then there's a right to get out of it. So if for some reason you decided, okay, I just want to retire, I don't want to sell, or you can't sell it for what you want to, and it makes more sense just to shut the door down, we'll negotiate a term giving you a mechanism just to terminate that lease. But again, these are things that, although the lawyers know how to write these documents, they're not asking the questions about how much longer are you going to practice? Do you want to sell the business? Is your son or daughter coming into the business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're asking all these questions because we're trying to help you achieve the best scenario for you. And that's pretty much what we got. And we've been, like I said, we, in addition to the lease renewals, we also can help with a new lease for another office, a purchase. We do sales as well. We can do ground up. I would tell you, depending on where you are in New Jersey, it can be a challenge. The more dense the area you are in, the more expensive it's going to be, and it may be cost prohibitive to look at a ground up. And I say ground up, I mean, we find a piece of land for you, and then we actually develop and build the building. The problem is most of you are probably in that 2,000 to 5,000 square foot building, which the numbers probably won't make sense. However, it depends where. And again, I will say it's a different time. If there's an empty bank branch that's 3,500 square feet with parking and visibility, and they're willing to sell it, maybe it does make sense. But again, we'll exhaust those opportunities, and we'll look at everything that that is out there for you. Tom, anything to add before we see if we have some questions?
Just kind of want to wrap up the point, similar to what you said. There may have been some things, you may be looking at your lease and saying, I have a couple years left. And, normally, you wouldn't really be able to do much, but like we had kind of alluded to throughout the whole presentation, it's an extremely unique time right now with everything going on in the market. And with that being said, I mean, it pretty much puts a ton of advantage, on your side. So kind of no matter what the situation is, obviously everybody's situation is different. But obviously it's best if we can kind of talk through what you're currently paying on your rent, what your situation is, and if you're in that right period of where we could start a renewal phase or anything like that. There's a ton of ways that we could help, and if not, kind of put together a game plan on how to kind of take care of everything in the future. That's important as well. So I think that kind of wraps it up.
Okay, well, I'd like to extend our sincere appreciation to Chuck and Tom. Thank everyone for attending the webinar. Again, a lot of good information. I think the realization of how the optometric physician really is in the driver's seats for some significant savings, and worst case scenario, the renter says no. Best case, it sounds like there's a lot of potential opportunities. So hopefully we could get this message out and have people take advantage of this once in a lifetime opportunity. So thanks again to our sponsors, Health Pro Realty Group, for making this afternoon's webinar possible. And it concludes our webinar. Thanks again for attending.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, George.
And I exit.